this is the last slot, the very last slot. And I have a great pleasure to invite Paula Marentette, an on-site guest participant. And I guess Paula is the most on-site guest participant because she spent like more than a week in our beautiful city and knows a few words in Polish. So Paula is a professor at Augustana campus, the Department of Social Sciences, University of Alberta, Canada. Hope I got it right. She's a developmental psycholinguist who specifically looks at gestures and the role in the development of communication and cognition in children. So again, she brings a crucial perspective, that is the developmental perspective, which is of course important in itself, but also it is important for other fields, like particularly language evolution. And she published extensively in top journals, like in very top journals, such as Science, Developmental Science, or Child Development. I was familiar with Paula's work for some time, but I was very excited to see the article actually about pantomime, that is pantomime, not silent gesture, in multimodal communication, when she takes an issue with McNeil's approach to pantomime. So we look forward to your talk, Pantomime Use in Children, Symbolic, Pragmatic. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Does this work? Can people hear me in Zoom land? Multiple amplifying things here. So I'm very honored to be invited to this workshop, which has been very thought-provoking and engaging, and it was worth breaking the travel fast to be present with other people thinking about these really complex topics. So I'm going to focus today on what Michael Arby described yesterday in the panel as the very littlest unit that was introduced by Laurel Folksbaum when she talked about the body parts object, the imagined object gestures that and I'm going to, I left aside my issue because I can't do both. So I'm going to really examine Werner and Kaplan and so thank you for humoring me if this is all obvious to you already, but it was really helpful for me to work through the specifics of what the claim is about symbolic. So children's symbol development, they're thought to be capable of doing symbolic representation in several formats by quite young ages. So by a year and a half, children can say words and are thought to mean what they're saying, to use them in a representative manner. By 2.5 years, we see them using other forms of symbolic representation, including pictures and video, and by 3, sophisticated forms of symbolic play. But in contrast, one particular task, that of the elicited pantomime, has been interpreted as revealing a lack of symbolic capacity in children aged 3 that isn't resolved until they're about 6 to 8 years of age. So the elicited pantomime task is pretty straightforward. Children are asked to pretend to or show brushing their teeth, drinking from a cup, cutting with scissors, something like that. There are no more instructions than that. Most of the studies that are done using this task use a very small set of objects, usually 8, for no good reason, just because. And my question really is, why do we think when children are quite symbolically functional, that the elicited pantomime task reveals some kind of lack of symbolic capacity? So why is pantomime posing a challenge for preschoolers compared to all the other things that they do quite well? So the limitation may be part of the elicited pantomime task itself. So using other tasks, researchers have found that children are willing to accept gestures as names for things by 17 months of age, and that's the work of Laura and Amy, and definitely by 26 months of age, and that is the work of Striano, Rochat, and Legersti. Though it must be noted that at 26 months of age, children still prefer words to gesture. Again, the work of Laura and Amy and Sandra Waxman. So gesture itself doesn't appear to be a problem in terms of symbolic status, but iconicity may play a role. That is, children are willing to use iconic gestures as reference, while they reject arbitrary gestures. So there's something more complex going on here. In terms of assumptions, I am only looking at, I'll call them modern children, I'm not sure what else to, real live children today with modern brains. But it makes sense to me from an evolutionary perspective that we haven't changed the brain structure. So I'm willing to go with the idea of a language ready brain, as Michael Arbib has presented. I do follow quite strongly the ideas of Michael Tomasello in terms of the importance of a symbol-rich sociocultural context in which language is developed. And I just wanted to introduce this quote that really makes a lot of sense to me from a paper in 2018 by Gong et al. The languages children learn have evolved to fit with the guesses children are likely to make. I think this makes sense in terms of the language ready brain. What children are doing is using their cognition, and language follows the way children's cognition leads. So I'm going to talk about symbolic distancing, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about body part as object and imagined object. And so I have lots of questions for Stephen, but I couldn't do it right before I give my own talk because I have to remember what I think about it first. And then I may have a few other little bits of evidence. And I'm going to turn to talk about ontogeny and phylogeny after that. So Werner and Kaplan. This is a weighty book. Literally, I don't know if you've ever held a copy of this book, but it was printed on, I don't know, really heavy duty paper. It's actually really heavy. But the ideas of symbol formation that are generated in this permeate language acquisition literature. They appear all over the place, and they are central to people's interpretation of the elicited pantomime device. That research is typically done by cognitive developmental researchers, people who don't actually study gesture. And I think that might matter in how they use symbolic distancing. So Werner and Kaplan fall wholeheartedly in favor of the idea of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny in terms of language. That makes complete sense to them. And they argue that symbols arrive from an internal shift in how objects are treated. They move from things of action, which they talk about as pragmatic, to things of contemplation. We can know things about the world because of this shift that happens internally. And there are lots of ways that this concept is discussed in the book, but I really want to focus on the relationship between the symbolic vehicle and the referent. So I think none of this will surprise you. They thought that the symbolic vehicle had to be arbitrary. I will come back to that idea. That the symbolic vehicle, the arbitrariness is a function of the fusion or indissolubility of form and meaning. The symbol has to have this fused sense. And I can't emphasize enough how important the arbitrary form is for Werner and Kaplan. It has to be intentionally used, and we're good on that. And if you ask me during questions, we can have a little light moment, and I'll show you the link to semantic satiation, which is a concept that Werner and Kaplan use abundantly to illustrate this idea of the fusion of form and meaning, because in semantic satiation, it breaks down and all of a sudden the word it's not a symbol anymore. And then finally, a symbolic vehicle has to have duality. That is, the child has to be aware that the symbol and the referent are distinct. And I'm going to argue that one of the reasons that, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons perhaps that Werner and Kaplan focused so much on that's not what I want to do, on arbitrary patterns, is because it makes duality really easy to measure. If you're dealing with an arbitrary pattern, you have this, it's much easier to demonstrate that a child is exhibiting duality. Whereas if you have an iconic form, it's much less clear. So to quote them, Werner and Kaplan proposed 3 stages of symbolic distancing. So there's progressive distancing, a decrease in the tangible likeness. Here's a focus on the need for the form to be more and more arbitrary between the external form of the vehicle and the referent. And the way that happens is starting with this mimetic facsimile of the referent, by which you can think of highly iconic representations, primarily gestures, and Werner and Kaplan expect those to be gestural in form. They talk about a stage that I'm not going to talk about, and I think you can't read here anyway because the font is bad, where the vehicle and the referent are still formed by a bond of external similarity, but they're carried by different modalities. But this is still verbal. This is now verbal in Werner and Kaplan's story. By modality, they mean using sound to represent shape or something like that. So I'm going to not talk about that middle stage, and then we'll come back to the final stage here, which is a conventional representation where the external form of the vehicle and the referent has lost most, if not all, of its surface similarity. So they're really focused on the loss of iconicity and the development of arbitrary form. In terms of gestures, Werner and Kaplan argue that they are at best proto-symbols. From true symbols, we distinguish then those productions where the vehicular structures, that's the eventual symbol, imagery, visual or verbal patterns, gesture, directly present rather than represent. So there is no distance here. This is where the language comes from. Proto-symbols lack the intentional act. And we go on to say they may be transformed into true symbols by progressive differentiation of vehicle and referent meaning. Note here that even intentionality is marked by the arbitrariness of the symbol. Intentionality is not marked by any effort to assess communicative features of the child's behavior. It's just, is the symbol arbitrary or not? And if it's not, then it's not intentional. So at every phase, Werner and Kaplan are loading a lot of weight on whether or not something is a symbol on the form of that symbolic vehicle. Can gestures be symbols? They ask this question and answer it, no. In essence, no, they cannot. Their opinion, not mine. Bodily gestures rarely, if ever, attain a level of full autonomy, although they could potentially reach such a level. And the footnote is about primitive cultures, and I didn't put it in on purpose. They do not comprise a full-fledged system of significant signs. Even at its best, however, depiction through gestures remains at a relatively primitive level. They like that word. When compared with the tremendous development of the representative function realized through and carried by the vocal articulatory medium. You can probably see where I'm going to go. I had a small outburst yesterday where I stamped on the floor. You can probably see where I'm going to go with this. Werner and Kaplan hold what I believe, and I do not think that this is just my opinion. I think it's broadly agreed in the research community now, an untenable position that really focuses on arbitrary form. The notion that gesture cannot support language is simply not true. And I would further argue that the notion that arbitrariness is essential is no longer broadly held in the linguistic community. And William Stokey, who started the analysis of American Sign Language, published in 1960, but I would argue that Werner and Kaplan either weren't aware or did not understand the significance of that work. And work that is going right from that time up until now, sign linguists really looking at arbitrary forms and, iconic forms in speech and sound symbolism suggests that these are just untenable positions. So we'll ignore them. And what we still need to deal with this notion of symbolic distancing, and can we salvage this idea without having to rely on the arbitrary form? And does it make sense to say that action leads to knowing? And I'm going to talk at the very end about ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. I was glad when you finally said that earlier today. But I don't do evolution work, so it's like, am I dragging in something from some long dead argument? I think that we don't really support the notion that morphological form exhibits this truth. But I think that the question is that seems to me must be addressed in terms of looking at language evolution is whether ontogeny can tell us anything about phylogeny in terms of cognitive development, in terms of the development of language. So the working definition of elicited pantomime that's used by researchers in this area is not complicated at all. The working definition is whatever happens when you ask a kid to show me or pretend. That's the working definition. So these papers are not methodologically rich in their discussion of how the data were collected, and they're really not rich in terms of how the data were coded, which is why I asked Laurel Buxbaum the other day, how do you code? How do you know what the right answer is? And her methodology is much richer than what's seen in these papers. In fact, the papers don't even ever address whether or not the children speak when they're giving these responses. So if a core part of pantomime is that it's typically not accompanied by speech, I can't tell you that we have that. So these are called pantomime tasks. They may be, they may not. I think that's really open for discussion. But a lot of conclusions arise from this. So now I have to go back and pay attention to my notes. Contemporary with Werner and Bernard Kaplan, who wrote the book, Goodglass and Edith Kaplan, that's a complicated relationship I finally figured out if you ever want to ask me. In 1963, the same year that Werner and B. Kaplan wrote their book, published a paper looking at body part as object and imagined object in aphasic apraxis. And in discussing those results, where they looked at male intelligence matched, brain damaged, brain injured individuals, where the aphasic apraxics were matched with non-aphasic people who were who had some sort of trauma to their brain, all men. What they found was that 25% of the time the aphasic apraxis, it's not hard for me to, it's not easy for me to tell in the paper which, and I think as Laurel Buxbaum showed us, it's not ever easy to tell which. 25% of the time they produce these body part as object. So I just want you to hear that. 25% of the time compared to something like 6% of the time for the non-aphasics. So yes, they do it more, but note that 75% of the time they did something different, but that gets lost a lot. In written conversation with Werner, Goodglass and Kaplan quote this from Werner in discussing this use of body part as object. The subject behaves as though he really had to stir his coffee, comb his hair, etc., and uses his fingers out of necessity 25% of the time. One may say both of the child and the brain-injured dyspraxic patient that the use of body part as object permits them to avoid an impaired, or for the children, undeveloped function. It's very black and white. So let's talk about body part as object. And I hope you're still watching, Stephen, and I really need a copy of that table you presented where you divide it differently, and I will be emailing you asking for that. Body part as object, and this is their, how the field uses this term. And I'm going to use the example of scissors, and those of you who know about this research will know that I'm playing a game here, and I will reveal it shortly. But I'm going to use the examples of scissors. So the body part as object, scissors is like this, where the fingers represent the blades of the scissors, and typically also, almost always also, you also show the function of the object. So body part as object, and this is not acknowledged frequently in the literature, demonstrates more information. It is form and function. Also, this is called, often in sign linguistics, hand as object, and in Cornelia's would be also object in her division. The other one is imagined object, and I'm not ignoring your third body part as your other body part as object, Stephen. I'll get there. The other one that's talked about is imagined object, and you can't really see, there's a ghost of a pair of scissors there. I didn't use the right font. And the fingers that are active in this are different. So you get something like this, where you pretend that there are scissors, you pretend to be holding them. And this is the right answer for when you're asked, pretend you're using scissors. The right answer is to do this. The wrong answer is to do this. So the aphasic apraxics do this more often than this. This imagined object, also described as hand. This is an enactment in Cornelia Mueller's, and note that it represents the function of the object, but not its form. So you can't possibly read this. I'm just trying to show you, even in just the elicited pantomime literature, which is all I'm summarizing today, this use of symbolic distancing that Werner and Kaplan originate is everywhere. It is the explanation for the results that are achieved in this literature. And here is the summary. Body part as object is described as an undeveloped symbolic function. It shows a lack of differentiation between the agent and the implement, because the agent, the child, and this might interest Stephen, the agent, whoever's doing it, whoever's holding the scissors, and the scissors are both represented. In comparison with imagined object, which is symbolically mediated, developmentally advanced, shows increased distancing between the substitute and the referent object. So this transition from body part as object to imagined object is considered to be really important in symbol development. This is used as the example of symbolic distancing. And the research is pretty clear that this is what happens. If you look between the ages of 3 and 9 years, given in months for some obscure reason, on this graph from Mitchell and Clark, so this is a fairly recent paper in 2015, they plot nicely the results of all the studies showing the proportion of imagined object use in each study. And you see that use of imagined object increases with age. And this is a classic finding replicated all these times. I would, however, just call to your attention the variability within any one age group. I do not have expert mastery of this laser pointer. So there is variability, but the general developmental trend can't really be disputed. So I'm gonna, whoa, stop. Okay, Good. Now I'm going to tell you what I thought I was going to tell you before it started. I didn't expect it to go automatically. So the data that I'm showing today comes from a paradigm I call Sammy's birthday, and I just want to explain a little bit about how that works. This is Sammy over here. Sammy is a sloth puppet. You know, sloths are nocturnal, and that means that they sleep in the daytime. They're really tired in the day. And so it's Sammy's birthday. And Sammy has all these presents. You can't see them here. They're just out of sight of the camera. All these presents in gift bags. And they're really boring presents like spoons and rolling pins and combs and plastic forks, hammers, boring things like that. So the children are invited in and they're told this story about Sammy. And as soon as they tell this story and they'd agree to help Sammy open his presents, Sammy falls asleep. And so the children are allowed to pick a bag and they take the object out of the bag and we get rid of the bag and the child can talk about the object, we talk about it a little bit, they can hold it. And then for reasons that are mysterious and no child asked about, the present has to go in the box. And when it drops in the box, it makes a noise and Sammy wakes up. And then they are asked to tell Sammy what the present was or show Sammy what the present was. I was not sure whether Q would matter for these children. Tell Sammy what the present was or show Sammy what the present was. So this is a child who is 3-year-old. This is her birthday, 3 years old this day. And if I can make it go, I will play it again. Brilliant body part of this object. Oh, there's another one. Okay. So this child is 3 years, 2 months old. Do you need to see it again? Is that clear? No? Yes? Nobody cares. Okay. Clear. Scissors are for cutting, and one hand is this way and one hand is this way. So you get all your options. So what Werner and Kaplan say specifically about scissors, which is why I pulled these examples out, is the following. So bear with me. Here's the moment. Here's the gotcha moment. Werner and Kaplan say, I'm going to actually read the whole quote. It is important to note that the transition from anticipatory behavior to representative gesture is often marked by a change in the form of the activity. Movements which derive from pragmatic actions, but which have become depictive gestures, are in subtle ways distinct in patterns of execution from anticipatory responses. A good example of this is the distance observable between anticipatory movements in cutting with scissors and representative gestures of cutting with scissors. In the first instance, the individual sets thumb and forefinger in a way to fit into the handles of the scissors. When, however, one exploits the pragmatic action for representation, so now this is the more sophisticated, they're arguing, there is a change in the selection of fingers and the manner in which they are held. The movements do not correspond with those of actual cutting. Instead, they express the dynamic activity of scissors cutting by imitating the movements of the instrument. No, you've seen that. You've seen that. Move on. I don't know if you have Madeline in Europe, but I grew up with this story and my children did. And we all loved when Miss Clavel sat up and turned on the light and said, something is not right. In this quote, what they are arguing, Werner and Kaplan in the same book, is that IO is easier and earlier than BPO, which is precisely opposite what they claim every other page in the book. So the only actual example I could find in the book of this development is an example which uses scissors. It's this example I just showed you. And it does not match the claim they make everywhere else in the book about what represents symbolic distancing. I find this bewildering, although I do have a good explanation. Suggestion. Note also, though, that researchers all fall in line with this, right? This is what the research shows, that children, young children do this, BPO, and older children and adults do IO. In the aphasia literature, aphasic apraxics do BPO, non-damaged brains produce IO. Except I want to point out this lovely paper by Olga Kapirchi and her colleagues in 2011. It's a chapter in a book that I can't remember the name of right now, but I'll find it if you need it. It's one of the Benjamin's books, the one that came out in 2011 on gesture, where they argue specifically that BPO is hard, actually, which Stephen just argued in the previous. BPO, this is really hard. So let's think about that. So I told you a little bit about the design of this study. I had 40 children between the ages of their 3rd and 4th birthdays. It was a between subject design. 20 of the children got the show Sammy Q, 20 of them got the tell Sammy Q. There were 20 objects because I thought we really couldn't tell a lot about 8. So we really put the kids through it. Like this was go, go, go. They also did the expressive language test, the EVT, which showed nothing. There's no correlation here in any way at all. So I won't refer to it again. What did we find? These are just counts mostly. I did one analysis, but these are just counts because I'm still trying to figure out how to do the analysis. And when I got here, I found I couldn't use JASP on my iPad. So you'll just have to look at the numbers with me and we'll do descriptive observations. What the children like to do most of all is nothing. So their first preference is to not say anything, do anything, use their hands at all. That's their first preference. And we are chugging them through this to get through 20 objects before a 3-year-old loses interest or will. Their next preference is BPO, as we would expect from the literature. They produce more BPO, but I would just like you to see how much IO they actually produce. It's a lot, actually. So in this black and white world where there's this and then there's that, these data are hard to explain. Q does not matter. This did come from JASP. It's a fun new graph they do in JASP. I really like this. So you can see the individual data points of the 20 kids who respond to tell and the 20 kids who respond to show with these 20 objects. And there's nothing, there's no difference here. There is a default of not responding. We've already seen that. But there's a whole range of proportion of IO use. So this is proportion IO, and some kids are doing almost all their gestures as IO. But this is true, 60% of the gestures as IO, but there's no difference between conditions. If we look at, what is this one? So I already said show versus tell doesn't matter, but does it matter whether the children are actually speaking or not? So these first four bars are when the child is using co-speech. The next 4 bars are when they do not produce any speech, but note that I include onomatopoeia, like just sounds, not words like meow. There were no cats, this was just objects. So any banging they do or anything like that, any sounds they make are included in non-co-speech. What we see is that while there is a preponderance of gestures that are BPO in the tell condition for using co-speech gesture, what I think is important is that the IO gestures occur in all 4 of these circumstances. They occur across show and tell, and they occur relatively equally whether or not the children are using co-speech. And then the last thing is something that I think is actually driving choices of IO and BPO is the object. It has less to do with the child's cognitive capacity and more to do with the object. So we see some objects that they don't really care to gesture about at all, either BPO or IO. This is a paired, the lines mark the pairing. So, so this object, which has a strong preference for BPO, therefore necessarily has a low preference for IO. So they have to be, like there isn't an option to show a strong preference for both. That isn't an option in the way this is presented. But we see objects that strongly prefer IO, objects that strongly prefer BPO, and objects, because a lot of the time the kids just don't respond, that don't show either. So to summarize that data, 3-year-olds do produce more BPO than IO. They also produce a lot of imagined object gestures. And this fact, because I'm not the only one that's shown it, it actually shows up in the Mitchell and Clark graph. If you look at the variability, this fact hasn't really been explained by using this idea of symbolic distancing. The verbal cue you give to the child does not matter. And so I'm not actually sure whether we want to call this a pantomime task. I think calling it the elicited pantomime task may not be a great name for it, but I also am with Cornelia Mueller in thinking that this division between whether it's got co-speech gesture and not co-speech gesture, I just don't think it's that important. So I introduced that notion of how we call it. I'm not sure it has the right name, but I don't know that it matters. I would like to point out that the imagined object gestures occur equally likely with and without speech, again, undermining the notion that the speech cue for these modern children has much to do with what they do with their gesture. And then the form may be related to object affordances because we see differences by object. And I just loved in this just recent paper, the notion that posture matters, that when you ask people to stand up when they're typically standing up when they do charades. But if you made them sit down, it would probably make a difference in their charades game. And I would love to see if we took the table away. But I don't want to be the one to collect that data because corralling a 3-year-old when they're not in a chair, it's ugly. I am reminded by a mentor from my PhD, John McNamara, who argued that cognition precedes language, at least in ontogeny. And also in much earlier work by Elizabeth Bates and her colleagues, that symbol development is modality 3 free by 13 months of age. And the thing that I have been perplexed about for a long time, which led me to do this study, is this: everybody says gesture is easy. Gesture is easier than words. And everybody says iconicity is easy. Iconicity is so much easier than arbitrary form. And yet at the same time, we want to believe those things and believe that 3-year-olds can't do imagined object. It's too hard because they can't do symbolic distancing. They have to be able to use their hands to represent the object in a concrete form. They cannot do imagined object, except for that they do. So we know that some of these things aren't true, but we ignore that when it's not convenient. And the other thing that I really can't get over is we ignore that they're using the hardest symbol of all. In fact, the first symbol these children learn is a verbal symbol, the arbitrary one, the one that is supposed to be really hard for them. And yet that's what they do first. Pointing and conventional gestures that are taught show up earlier, but those first symbolic words, they come pretty early. And they're certainly much earlier than the age of 3. When we're saying these children can't do, that this is not a symbolic form, their gestures can't be symbolic. I swear, it's just great to be able to say that out loud and have people listen, because I've been mulling about this for a decade or more. And so, oh, you can't even see the, I use too much subtle gray. This is the description underneath here of Werner and Kaplan's depiction of symbolic development, but you can't see it because my claim really is that the description of symbolic development can't be based on form. It does not make sense to focus on the need for an arbitrary referent and say, therefore, they have limited symbolic capacity. We have to find some other reason why they're using BPO early and IO later. A couple of alternatives, as I've already said, 3-year-olds can produce imagined object gestures. And in fact, in a study published with Virginia Volterra and Paula Marentette and Ariane Bello in 2016, we looked at Italian and Canadian 2-year-olds and found, and here's where Stephen's, I can't remember what his subscripts were because I can't think about my talk and his at the same time. I think BPO egocentric. In this paper, what we called that was own body. This is when they used their body to depict an action that didn't involve an object. So swimming, or including also a lion. A picture of a lion roaring exhibited this often in children. So they were using their own body to represent animate things that were doing actions without objects. So I have separated that out because in the elicited pantomime task, there are always objects. But I think that this fits into Stevens as the BPO egocentric. I'm not sure about that. The BPO here is what I'm talking about. We expect children who are 2 to do BPO. But what's interesting is this group of kids did just as much, if not more, for the Italians' imagined object gestures. So at the age of 2 already, they are showing this capacity. We have to stop saying that 3-year-olds can't do this. So there are a few people who acknowledge this, including Edith Kaplan, who was the one who first looked at this in children. She did that paper with aphasics with Goodglass in '63, and in '68 did her PhD dissertation looking at children. And she's much more subtle about how this work gets interpreted than most researchers who have followed her. I really like the work of Bigham and Bourchier-Sutton, who really look at a wide range of object substitutions and they find no difference between imagined object and body part as object. And then the Mitchell and Clark paper returning to a somewhat more subtle interpretation of what's going on with these kids. My own view is that children are highly influenced by objects, that they are task sensitive, and the ecological validity of this task really has to be questioned. You put a 3-year-old on a table and you either show them a picture or show them some scissors and say, show me how you use this. And for a 3-year-old, I think they're going to think, this is dumb. Show me how you brush your teeth. It's like, no, you're like the parent person. You know how to brush your teeth. So precisely what do you want out of me? And I think one explanation we need to consider is that the children are using a communicatively rich piece of information, the body part as object, which uses form and function. Just like, I have no idea what you want, but I'm going to give you everything I can. Not that that's a conscious choice, but I think that that's one possibility we need to consider, that it's a task demand that leads them to do body part as object. And by the time they're 6, they've been to school and they know that adults will regularly ask them stupid questions, and they know how to just play the game and go along. And it's like, you want me to show? Okay, I'll do that, fine. Also, they've had more experience to how their culture represents using scissors, because this is not something that 3-year-olds see a lot of. Pantomime about everyday objects. So a variety of objects, and that's what I mean by naive, just that they don't see these kinds of gestures frequently. So they're pulling something out of the air. Okay, is this what you want? Maybe this is good. And then something I would like to remind researchers is that children are not deficient adults. So they solve problems in qualitatively different ways than adults. And in particular, I wish I could remind Werner and Kaplan of this. I don't think that they remember that for the child's cognitive system, you don't analyze it assuming that the target goal is the adult state. When you look at the child's cognitive system, you have to look at that system as its own thing, because Piaget, like we know that there are qualitatively different ways of thinking exhibited in children, particularly in this age group. And it's not just Piaget who thinks that. So I would, in this context, say what we know about 3-year-olds is they're wizard at frequent and systematic symbolic reference. They're really good at words. They're really, really good at it. And by the time they're 3, they're pretty good at understanding iconic gestures. They're dodgy at understanding arbitrary gestures. And these are hearing children of hearing parents. They don't see a lot of arbitrary gestures. So they're quite conservative about unsystematic or rare events, including certainly gestures for everyday objects, which minimally are less frequent than arbitrary words for everyday objects, and pantomime, which they see, but not with the same systematicity or frequency that they see words. And I also think, as I mentioned before, that they're naive to whatever social system is used for gesture compared to older children. So they have their own thinking process that's happening in this moment. A quick, do I have time for this? A quick reference to work that I did with Elena Nicolatis in 2011, where I was really trying to get at this role of iconicity. So this data came from 3.5 to 5-year-olds. And just as an example that they are wary of unfamiliar systems. So what we were doing was a fast mapping task. We showed children a gesture and gave them 4 novel objects they hadn't seen before. I have a great collection of objects children don't know. Awesome collection of that. And we showed them either an iconic gesture or a novel noun or an arbitrary gesture. And when there were 4 objects, I'm not supposed to stand here, I'm supposed to use the red thing. With the iconic gesture, they guessed correctly, they guessed the object that was the source of the iconic gesture. With the novel noun, what we chose as the target was their most frequently chosen object, because there is, of course, no target. And so they were much less good at this, obviously, because there's no right answer, but the point is the children disagreed wildly what was the right answer. And virtually the same results for an arbitrary gesture. So here they're treating a novel noun where there is no cue to what it might mean, quite the same as how they're treating an arbitrary gesture. But if you go to a fast mapping situation where there is an obvious link, again, they get the iconic gesture, they get the novel noun is, they've only seen one, there's only one object they don't know what to do with there, and they apply the novel noun to that. But they do not fast map an arbitrary gesture to the one novel object. And so again, I think that we can just interpret this as evidence that these hearing children of hearing parents are wary of systems that they're not sure what to do with. So if we look at Werner and Kaplan's tenable positions of symbolic distancing, action, and knowing, which I would probably reframe using Clark's language that Herbert Clark, that Stephen just talked about that paper, as a move from action through gesture. And Clark uses depiction in a much broader way than drawing. It's a much broader sense through to the use of a symbol as a description. If that's what Werner and Kaplan mean, then I have a couple of suggestions. We really can't use this word arbitrary. It's garbage. It doesn't make any sense. And we have to, and I'm delighted to see that it is the standard word used in the last couple of days, focus on the idea of conventionalization. And then the second thing I guess I would want to say is I'm not convinced that we actually see a difference in symbolic status, given the data I had shown you, between gestures that are depictive, even though they're iconic, and symbols, arbitrary words. I'm not convinced that I see that distinction. And in terms of, this is my last point, ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, in modern children who are in a language using environment with adults, they are in this environment and they have adults who provide rich interpretation. That is, adults talking to them, being with them, communicating with them, assume the child is trying to communicate. I think that reading in that adults do is a critical environment in which children learn language, that the child is assumed to be more capable than they may actually be. And I don't know if it's hominid or hominin. I don't work in this field, but the early H1, whatever it is, who may have a language ready brain, but isn't having abundant symbol use in the environment. It's a very different context. And what I see here in terms of the recent paper by Sivichinski and the rest of you who are here, Marta and Sławek, that in phylogeny, the argument is that pantomime precedes symbol use, but in ontogeny, I think it's actually the reverse. And Michael Arbib doesn't like that, so I'm going to just stop now. Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. Fitting conclusion to our workshop. So the floor is open to questions. Mike.
So no, I actually agree with you, except I'd phrase it just a little bit differently. I think you're quite right. Ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny because in ontogeny, there weren't people who already had a language to learn from. But I think, I mean, I was delighted that you quote Virginia Volterra and worked with her because we talk a lot to each other. And I think it's rather that I think her data seem to show that the kids do start with something a bit like pantomime, but because they're in a language-rich environment, eventually the rise in those gestures tails off as their access to words goes up. So I wouldn't say it appears to be the reverse. I think it's just that because they're in the language-rich environment, the role of pantomime soon becomes, if our theory of language origins is correct, it's that we develop words because they're easier to use and more powerful than pantomimes. So it's if you've got a choice, you take the more nourishing option, but it takes the kid till about 14 months, I think, before the adoption of words, or if they're deaf kids, the adoption of the conventionalized signs takes over. So I agree with what you were saying. It's just a little bit of changing of the wording.
This is too strong. I think I probably agree with you. My point here is that if you think about elicited pantomime, the way it's talked about in the literature, then that is not true. Children, this claim that elicited pantomime comes so late and it takes them so long to develop, that's garbage. That's perhaps not a word I should use. That is not supported by evidence.
Yeah. And just a question, since you're a fan of Caperci and Volterra, are their action gestures the same as your BPOs?
So this is where I differ with Virginia Volterra. I hope she's not watching.
I'll tell her either way.
Yes, I'm sure you will. It's okay. She knows. She's heard it from me. I prefer to look at empty-handed gestures because I think it's very complicated to know what the symbolic intention or the communicative intention is of a child who's holding an object. And I know that there are people who disagree with that. I think Martha Alibali also doesn't find a difference between a teacher using an object to demonstrate something and not using an object. But I don't lump those together. In this study, in any of the studies that I've worked on, the children don't have access to the object. That's why the box is there. The kids never ask, but I want the box. I want the objects out of sight and out of hand.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think I agreed with just about everything apart from this slide as well, so
Yep.
we don't have to talk about it here. I have to say that I have to go back to Werner Kaplan, and I have to admit I haven't read them as carefully as you have. For one reason, I don't even have the whole book. Lauren McCune sent me about 100-page copy from the book. He said, "Oh, this is all you need to read, Jordan." So maybe she edited away the parts about arbitrariness, etc. But I mean, the whole notion of a symbolic distancing is a metaphor, right? Distancing, it's not that there's a space between them, but it's kind of not such a bad metaphor because it's a gradual one, right? You start from action and then you make differentiation, and differentiation, I think we all agree, is essential for there to be a sign, right? There has to be an expression in content, irrespective of whether the expression is gestural or pictorial or verbal, right? And also in one of the quotes you had there, it said, at the point in which they're fully differentiated, they have lost most, if not all, of the similarity. And that already cannot be arbitrariness, right? Most, even if you have some similarity, it's not arbitrary. So I think that maybe, you know, that they're arbitrary when they use that. Maybe that's kind of a playing to the times, the spirit of the times, you know. But to the point here, I actually understood them, and I think it makes much more sense in terms of their symbolic distancing and from action to symbol, to think of, let me use Cornelius' terminology, enacting gestures as having less distance than representing gestures. IOs having less distance than BPO, your only case in which you had otherwise. So right, I mean, because if you look at our Klein in Pantomime, we have enactment as primary characteristic of higher degree of pantomime, right? It's more egocentric, as Stephen would say. It's more closer to the body. And then, so maybe, what I agree mostly is that people have once called them imaginary objects. Once you call them imaginary, it sounds, oh, it's cognitively much more complex to use the imaginary rather than this one. But right, and also empirically, we have also attested these kind of enacting gestures in 1.5-year-olds in production, in 2-year-olds. A lot of the pantomimic gestures, well, much fewer representing gestures. So even without skipping the term recapitulation, I think that's old hat.
Yes.
But still, some kind of analogy between ontology and phylogeny would make a lot of sense, I think, of saying enacting gestures are come before. And the last thing to say is, I mean, this is production. This is why I really liked your study about comprehension. And Monica's thesis idea is based very much on the prediction that, one, there will be cases in which iconic gestures will be comprehended when there's no words there. So iconicity is not as difficult for children as some people like Susan Golding Meadow and others assume, right? So at least that's the hypothesis. And of the two different kinds of iconic gestures, the prediction is that the enacting ones, the so-called BPOs, will be easier. Sorry, the IOs will be easier than the BPOs. The enactments will be easier for the children to understand. Why so? Because they're closer to the motor mimetic schemas of the children themselves.
Okay, let's see if I can remember. I'm going to start with the last one so I don't forget. I think you're going to find it's the opposite. That's my expectation. I do not expect IO gestures to be easier than the other at all. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the results of Monica's work. I think what matters to me is that in terms of Werner and Kaplan's, this is a theory of the development of symbols. And the idea of symbolic distancing, I only showed you the literature that is about elicited pantomime. But the idea of symbolic distancing is used in lots of other literature, just assumed to be an accurate description of how children learn symbols and an explanation for why 3-year-olds do this or that, or 4-year-olds or whatever, particularly in their gestures. So it's used by Kazuki Sekine in a very recent paper. Jana Iverson, who is a gesture researcher, and I don't understand this, uses it all the time. And so this developmental theory is arguing that there is something flawed in the cognitive system in terms of children who are age 3 in their understanding of gestures. That's what I'm arguing against. So I don't spend anywhere near as much time thinking about evolution and the evolutionary validity of my positions as you do. So I will after these 2 days spend a lot more time thinking about really what's happening here. But my objection primarily is the notion that symbolic distancing describes something about the cognitive state of modern 3-year-olds, which may be less useful to you.
But again, don't you really at least like intuitively, it does make sense to think of enactments being more primary than embodiments, if we call them that, right? They're more pantomimic than the others. They're more egocentric. I mean, think what you just said in your data also. I mean, enact or Slavic's example, walking. It's much easier to enact by actually walking than actually to do like this, both in production and comprehension. So they're on the greater iconicity side rather than lower. So maybe something about that IO-BPO paradigm of pantomime, maybe that's where the fault is. People have overgeneralized the findings that come so much from that.
I think the point that may be confusing, Jordan, is that when you use scissors, you are attending to the blades of the scissors, not to what your hand is shaped like. And I think, therefore, thinking purely in motoric terms and not just in terms of the visual control of the affordances seems pretty important to me.
Except for that, if you look at the comprehension and you have a variety of objects which have to be handled, so I'm thinking about Monica's study now, I think it's going to be much harder to know what they're handling because the object is imaginary. So I think it's going to be much harder for children to understand this IO gesture.
That's point. I mean, the data will show, but it's a loop, as we say, between data and ideas and intuitions. I think also Peter's distinction today between kind of pantomime for demonstration and pantomime for detached communication would be interesting too, because if the enactment gestures correspond to something in the repertoire of children, like eating, like jumping, like etc. I mean, even pretending to be a tiger, right?
Yes.
I think they would understand it much easier than, let's say, rowing a boat or something like that. I think that it's an extra
Yes.
dimension.
I absolutely agree that the enactment gestures will be easier than the imagined objects.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm kind of have a question about like the concept of symbolic distancing. Is your argument that it's like generally it's kind of a bad concept, or that kind of the things that you are often used to demonstrate symbolic distancing are not good examples of that process? Because I was thinking about like the research on non-human primates and like decoupled representations and kind of the whole kind of cognitive control thing, the famous reverse contingency paradigm where basically you have like big pile of food and a small pile of food, and kind of in order to get the big pile of food, you have to point towards to the small pile of food, and kind of most non-human animals find that very, very challenging because they cannot decouple kind of the action link. But if you then kind of have them point at symbols, then they learn it very, very easily. So that's why I was wondering how kind of what you said relates to kind of this bigger kind of investigation.
So I don't know this literature, but if they can learn the symbols easier than the actual real thing, that would seem to argue against symbolic distancing.
So the idea is that the symbol is something. Oh yeah. So the idea is that it's like the symbol that you kind of put in between the action perception link, and it's kind of a mediating thing that gives you more kind of decoupled representations, cognitive control.
Does that not argue against symbolic distancing?
And it kind of depends on. It's more like symbols used for distancing.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what Werner and Kaplan are arguing, because what they're arguing is you have to have this iconic intermediary until you can get to an arbitrary symbol.
Okay.
And so do I think the idea is garbage? And what I'm really upset about is the focus on arbitrariness, which I agree, Jordan, is a function of their time. We just know that's not true anymore. But I think that this, there is an underlying assumption amongst researchers who don't do gesture work and don't know about the sign language research very well, that this is like still a thing. That arbitrary matters, that speech is better, that words are somehow supreme. And so this is not the right context to whine about that, I guess. But so once you get rid of the arbitrary thing, I think what we don't have is any good evidence that symbolic distancing happens. Whether or not I'm willing to throw out the idea, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. So we can like keep the term but throw out the actual meaning of it.
I'll think about it.
There's a lot happening on Zoom, so.
Sorry.
Okay, so first we have a comment from Monika Boruta-Żybczyńska. It just came to me that we actually have one video of a person in a wheelchair who does pantomimes from the list Marta presented earlier today. Perhaps we could take a look at it, and then Marta replied that we do have those videos somewhere in the lab, but we would have to look for them. So perhaps if anyone's interested, we can share it later online. Next, we have a question from Stephen Brown. You showed a huge interaction between pantomime type and speech. BPO is much less frequent without speech. What is your explanation for that?
I assume this is what you mean, much less frequent without speech. I think it's going to be in the, I think I don't have an explanation. I was going to say something and it just became obvious to me that it's not true. I don't have one, but I will work on it. How's that? What I've been trying to understand is whether or not speaking or not speaking should make a difference to the gesture. And if you're McNeil, I think you think it would, but I'm not. I haven't figured out what I think.
So Stephen Brown says, thank you. And we have one final comment from Cornelia Miller. Thank you, Paula, for a beautiful talk. I think it is enormously important to take into account the affordances. I'm sorry, I have to leave now. I will be in touch by email.
Excellent.
This is the entirety of discussion from Zoom.
I'm good.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt because I'm the last speaker. So I have the opportunity to say thank you to the people that organized the conference and put together this really stimulating workshop where we, I think, heard a wide variety of approaches to pantomime, and I think we'll all go home with a lot to really think about in terms of what it means.
Well, actually, I wanted to end the to have a final word, but now I guess I don't have to do that. And I won't say anything. Perhaps apart from that, it's been hard, tiring, but I think these were very successful 2 days. So it would be nice to have others to be able to look at our discussion. So I hope that the volume that we are planning, that you will contribute, will be able to publish it. But I do like to thank the people who helped us, like our TV team, headed by Jacek. So without you, we would be completely lost. I would like to thank our assistants, Ola, Alex, Adam, Mariusz, and Jakub. I'd like to thank Monica, who coordinated all the actions. And now probably she's taking care of our dog and being on Zoom. And well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank all our speakers. It's been great. You devoted your time. Some of you came to Toru, so you were on Zoom, so thanks a lot.